The spring of 1944. Across the English Channel, the Allied armies prepared for the greatest amphibious invasion in history, Operation Overlord. While generals like Eisenhower and Montgomery planned the grand strategy, another man was quietly reshaping how war would sound and how destruction would arrive. That man was Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army. Calm, methodical, and intensely practical, Bradley understood that victory in Normandy would not depend on courage alone. It would depend on timing. To break through the formidable German defenses, the bocage, the hedgerows, the fortified villages, Bradley needed a new kind of weapon. Not a new gun, not a new tank, but a new idea. He called it time on target, a concept so simple, yet so devastating that it would leave the German army stunned and disoriented in seconds. At the heart of the system was coordination. In traditional artillery, shells landed in waves, one battery firing after another, their explosions spread out over time. But under Bradley's plan, every gun across miles of front would fire at different moments, so their shells would arrive on the target simultaneously. To the Germans, it would feel like the sky itself had exploded. No warning, no gradual increase, just instant thunder. The first hints of this new artillery doctrine appeared during training in England. Artillery officers, mathematicians, and forward observers worked tirelessly to synchronize hundreds of guns using nothing but maps, calculations, and stopwatches. They accounted for barrel length, powder temperature, wind, elevation, and even the curvature of the earth, all to ensure that every shell would reach the target at the same second. The soldiers who witnessed the first test called it the sound of Judgment Day. When the earth shook and the horizon vanished under fire, Bradley knew he had found the key to overwhelming the enemy's will to fight.
Meanwhile, across the Channel, the German 7th Army dug in. Their commander, General Friedrich Dahlmann, believed his defenses could hold any Allied advance. But his troops had no idea that soon, instead of hearing distant artillery before an attack, they would face destruction that arrived all at once. The stage was set. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the Allies stormed ashore on the beaches of Normandy, and behind them, hundreds of American artillery pieces waited silently, the thunderclouds of Bradley's new storm. The science of destruction. How time on target worked in Normandy. War is often measured in courage and numbers, men, tanks, and miles of front. But some battles are won in the ticking of a clock. Time on target was not a cannon or a soldier. It was a calculation, the ruthless, precise marriage of mathematics and metal that turned artillery into instantaneous judgment. At its simplest, time on target asks a single question. How do you make shells from many guns spread across miles fall at the same instant on a single point? The answer is a complex choreography of men, machines, meteorology, and mathematics. Every gun has a unique travel time to the target. That time depends on the gun's caliber, the propellant charge, barrel wear, elevation of the tube, and the range. Add wind, temperature, air pressure, and the subtle influence of Earth's curvature, and the travel times diverge. For a simultaneous strike, each battery must delay or advance its firing so that shells arrive together, which means some guns fire earlier, some later, but all are planned to finish at the exact same second. The operation began with intelligence and observation. Forward observers, officers and enlisted men, placed close to enemy positions, identified targets, fixed coordinates on the map, and called them back to the fire direction center. Those coordinates were then translated into range and bearing for each battery. At the Fire Direction Center, skilled technicians calculated the time of flight for each round. They used firing tables, dense, worn volumes that listed the time a shell of a specific type would take to reach a given range at a given charge and elevation. These weren't simple lookups. Meteorological reports from balloons or observation posts adjusted the tables, correcting for wind drift and air density. The result was a time in seconds, the moment a shell would take to reach the target if fired now. Visual: hands marking times on a blackboard, then transferring them to a master synchronization chart. Then came the simplest and most critical piece: synchronization. A single master zero time was chosen, the moment every shell should impact. From that moment, the Fire Direction Center calculated backwards. Battery A must fire at 0-25 seconds, Battery B at 0-41 seconds, Battery C at 0-17 seconds. The times were written, shouted, signaled.
Communications were the skeleton of the whole plan. Radios, landlines, signal flags, even runners carried the schedule. Any delay in the chain could upset the entire effect. And yet, despite the chaos of war, these communications often worked with astonishing precision. Chronographers and synchronized watches became as vital as sighting stakes. There was a human element too. Gun crews loaded by rote, officers called the firing commands, and the gun captains obeyed like clockwork. In a battery, the discipline of drilling turned soldiers into instruments of timing. The creak of the breech, the clank of the shell tray, the slap of rammer, each movement part of a larger metronome. But time on target was more than a technical marvel. It was a psychological weapon. When dozens or hundreds of shells land together, they create a sudden, all-encompassing shock. Instead of an enemy having seconds or minutes to react, to wake sentries, shelter troops, or move equipment, they are suddenly faced with the storm that obliterates their defenses and fractures command and control. It removed the warning and replaced it with instant thunder. In Normandy, the Allied staffs practiced time on target in training behind the beaches. Meteorologists measured winds at several altitudes. Forward observers rehearsed quick and precise reporting. Fire plans were drawn to support infantry landings, to suppress counter-battery fire, and to cut wire and demolish field fortifications. It could be used to precondition a battlefield, to punch predictable holes in the enemy's order of battle, or to deliver sudden, localized punishment aimed at disrupting a counterattack. TOT was also adaptable. It could be used as a preparatory bombardment, a concentrated opening salvo designed to soften resistance, or it could be targeted, a surgical strike on a command post or an assembly area. The same technique could create both the terrifying thunderclap that breaks morale and the precise strike that kills a key officer and collapses a defense. Yet the system had limits. Weather could introduce error. If the wind changed, shells could drift. If the enemy moved, the deadly convergence fell on empty ground. Allied planners knew these dangers. Redundancy was built in. Observers watched for deviations, and follow-up salvos adjusted. In the brutal economy of battle, even the most elegant theory required practical correction. On D-Day, time on target was not a single thunderclap, but a series of precisely timed storms. As amphibious forces hit the beaches and airborne troops seized inland positions, soaring arcs of steel were scheduled to arrive at moments intended to protect, to shock, and to deny the Germans any coherent reply.
By converting the chaotic roar of war into synchronized precision, Bradley's use of time on target turned artillery into a conductor of battle. It made the sky a weapon, and in doing so, changed the tempo of combat. The Germans had fought with courage and discipline for years, but in Normandy they met something else, a carefully measured tempest that arrived not as a warning, but as a verdict.
Shock and breakthrough. Time on target in the heat of battle. The morning mist hung low over the hedgerows of Normandy. Damp air carried the distant echo of engines, the shuffle of boots, and the quiet tension that always came before something catastrophic. Across the fields, American artillery units sat ready, their barrels elevated, their crews motionless, eyes fixed on the ticking second hands of synchronized watches. Then, without warning, the silence fractured. The horizon erupted in a single monstrous instant. Hundreds of shells, fired from guns spread across miles, converged upon the German lines at the exact same second. The effect was terrifying. Not a rolling barrage, not the gradual crescendo the German troops had learned to brace for, but a single blinding flash of destruction that arrived without sound or signal until it was already upon them. Men dove for cover. Command posts vanished under earth and flame. Radios fell silent. The German front line, veterans of years of combat, could not comprehend what had just happened. To them, it seemed as if the entire sky had detonated at once. Bradley's instant thunder had arrived. In the Bocage country, the terrain favored defenders. Every lane, every hedgerow, every farmhouse became a fortress. The Germans had perfected the art of ambush, waiting until Allied troops were close, then striking with machine guns and mortars from hidden positions. Normally, such strong points could delay an advance for hours, sometimes days. But time on target changed the rules. Before each attack, American observers identified the suspected German positions. The coordinates were transmitted back to the batteries, and the calculations began. Within minutes, fire direction centers synchronized their watches, adjusted for wind, temperature, and flight time. A single signal, a brief tone over the radio, set the sequence in motion. Seconds later, the shells landed all at once. No warning whistles, no time for the enemy to scatter. The hedgerows that had protected German troops turned into death traps. Branches, earth, and shrapnel mixed in a furious storm of steel. Within 30 seconds, entire positions ceased to exist. When the smoke cleared, the infantry moved forward through stunned resistance. Time on target was more than a weapon. It was a statement of precision warfare. The Americans had learned from the brutal lessons of earlier battles in North Africa and Italy, where artillery fire had been powerful but scattered. Now, in France, it became orchestrated destruction. The German soldiers called it Blitz ohne Flugzeuge, meaning lightning without aircraft. Many believed they were under air attack, not realizing it was the artillery alone. The first large-scale demonstration of this power came during Operation Cobra in late July 1944. Bradley's forces, stalled in the hedgerows for nearly 2 months, prepared to smash open the German front near Saint-Lô. The plan combined air bombardment with massed artillery.
a carefully timed storm meant to create shock, paralysis, and collapse. The artillery fire plan was a masterpiece of coordination. More than 1,500 guns were lined up along a 25-mile front. Each battery received its coordinates, firing angles, and exact firing times down to the second. The crews checked and rechecked their watches, their calculations, their elevation data.
At precisely 1100 hours, the order came. The earth shook under an ocean of steel. Every gun from light 105mm howitzers to massive 155mm long toms fired according to the time-on-target principle. Shells screamed overhead in layers, converging on German defenses that had already been battered by Allied bombers. But this time, the artillery finished what the bombers had begun. The German 352nd Infantry Division, already weakened and exhausted, simply disappeared. Command lines broke, radios were dead. The survivors, deafened, dazed, and terrified, surrendered or fled. It wasn't the scale of fire that shocked them most, it was the instantaneous impact, the lack of any warning, the way destruction arrived complete, as if summoned by a single word. In the aftermath, Allied infantry and armor surged forward through the shattered defenses. Roads once mined and blocked were suddenly open. The Germans tried to regroup, but without functioning communication or command posts, their response was fragmented and slow. For the first time since D-Day, the American advance gained unstoppable momentum. Time on target had proven itself not just as a tactical trick, but as an operational breakthrough. The technique's brilliance lay in its simplicity. Every gun's time of flight calculated, every clock synchronized, every shell programmed by the laws of physics to arrive in perfect unison. The battlefield was transformed into a conductor's score, and every explosion struck like a note in an overwhelming symphony. German officers captured after Cobra described the effect as total paralysis. Their artillery couldn't answer fast enough, their observers couldn't report, and their infantry couldn't move. Many believed they were facing a secret new weapon. But it wasn't a new weapon. It was time itself, weaponized. By the end of the first day, the U.S. 7th Corps had torn open a 6-mile gap in the German front. Within days, American armored divisions were racing through the breach, collapsing the enemy's western flank and pushing towards Avranches. The breakout from Normandy had begun, and with it, the beginning of the end for German forces in France. Behind the triumph stood a simple truth: precision, not brute force, wins modern wars. Bradley's quiet, mathematical idea had changed the tempo of battle forever.
Collapse of the German line. How instant thunder shattered command and morale. The aftermath of Operation Cobra was chaos. Where once there had been order and rigid discipline, the German front dissolved into a landscape of panic and broken communication. Entire divisions that had held firm for months were suddenly in retreat, leaving behind wrecked vehicles, abandoned artillery, and hastily scribbled orders that no one could follow. The American advance was relentless. What began as a single breakthrough expanded into a rolling collapse that spread across western France. Town after town fell as the German lines crumbled, not from lack of courage, but from the complete destruction of their ability to think, coordinate, or respond. Bradley's time-on-target barrages had done more than kill. They had blinded and deafened the enemy's command structure. German radio intercepts tell the story. Messages grew shorter, more frantic, and then ceased altogether. Command posts reported being under sudden bombardment, their lines cut, their officers missing. One report described it simply: "We are under fire from everywhere at once." To those inside the blast zones, there was no sense of direction, only overwhelming noise, smoke, and shock. The genius of instant thunder was psychological as much as physical. When hundreds of shells landed simultaneously, there was no gradual warning, no sequence of impact that the brain could process. The human mind, designed to react to patterns and escalation, was instead assaulted with total saturation. Soldiers described it as if the air had turned solid. In a matter of seconds, the very sense of control disappeared. Commanders couldn't issue orders, runners couldn't move, telephones were destroyed before they could even ring. The result was paralysis. For those who survived the first barrage, the instinct was not to fight, but to flee. In one engagement near the town of St. Gilles, a German artillery battalion was preparing a counter-barrage. They had coordinates on American armor and were minutes from firing. But the U.S. observers had already marked their position. At 10:04 a.m., the time-on-target strike hit. 18 guns, spread across 2 miles, fired in synchronized sequence. The German battery ceased to exist within 8 seconds. Trucks overturned, ammunition cooked off, and communication cables were shredded. Survivors stumbled out of their pits covered in dust and blood, unable to hear or think. The counterattack never happened.
These were not isolated cases. Across the front, similar stories repeated. German counteroffensives dissolved before they could begin. Bradley's artillery doctrine had removed one of the enemy's greatest strengths, the ability to react quickly. Without communication, German units became isolated pockets, surrounded by advancing Allied forces that seemed to move with impossible precision. Time on target also changed the rhythm of American attacks. In earlier campaigns, such as in Italy, artillery preparation often lasted for hours, giving defenders time to dig deeper or evacuate key positions. But now, fire missions could be prepared in minutes and executed instantly. Infantry commanders could request support and receive devastating coordinated fire almost before the message finished transmitting. This flexibility turned the U.S. First Army into a fluid, adaptive machine. Instead of rigid timetables, it fought through speed, surprise, and synchronization. German prisoners taken after Cobra spoke openly of their shock. One sergeant from the Panzerlaw division recalled, "We never heard the shells coming. 1 second we were standing, the next everything exploded. It felt like being struck by lightning." For many, the experience shattered morale. They began to see the Americans not just as soldiers, but as masters of an unseen science, capable of summoning destruction with impossible timing. Rumors spread through the ranks that the Allies had developed a new kind of radar-guided artillery, or secret technology to predict every move. The truth was simpler: the Allies had mastered coordination. By early August 1944, the German army in France was in full retreat. The erstwhile formidable panzer divisions were cut off, encircled and destroyed in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. Over 50,000 German troops were trapped under relentless bombardment. Time-on-target strikes targeted bridges, crossroads, and escape routes. Columns of vehicles caught in the open were obliterated before they could move. Smoke and fire marked every road. The survivors tried to flee on foot through the fields, only to face fresh salvos timed with ruthless precision. German commanders described the Allied artillery as inhumanly accurate. They no longer feared the sky, they feared the silence before the next thunderclap. Behind the devastation, Bradley remained calm and analytical. He understood that this victory was not about overwhelming numbers, but about synchronization and control. Every successful barrage, every broken German unit was the result of clocks ticking in harmony, of 1,000 calculations reduced to a single instant of destruction. For the German command, that instant was irreversible. Once time on target shattered their lines, no amount of discipline or courage could restore coherence. The war machine that had once crushed Europe was now disintegrating under its own confusion. By the time Allied forces liberated Paris later that August, the legend of instant thunder had already spread. American gunners were no longer just support troops, they were the silent storm, the invisible force that shaped every victory. Time on target had transformed artillery from a blunt instrument into a precise and terrifying science. It was not about firing more, it was about firing smarter. And in that new kind of warfare, Bradley's men had become the masters of time itself.
The legacy of instant thunder, redefining modern artillery warfare. When the dust of Normandy settled, the lessons of Bradley's instant thunder echoed far beyond the fields of France. The success of time on target had not only broken the German front, it had rewritten the doctrine of modern artillery. What began as a desperate innovation on the eve of D-Day became the foundation for how armies across the world would fight in the decades to come. Before Bradley, artillery was often thought of as a brute force weapon, powerful but imprecise, a tool for softening enemy positions rather than controlling the tempo of battle. After Normandy, that perception changed forever. Artillery became the conductor of modern warfare, shaping not just destruction, but timing, coordination, and psychological dominance. The core idea of time on target, that precision and synchronization can multiply firepower, spread rapidly through Allied command structures. In the months following the breakout from Normandy, the technique was standardized across American and British forces. Field manuals were rewritten. Fire direction centers were trained to calculate flight times faster, using refined tables and simplified charts. Every new offensive in France and Germany carried the fingerprints of this doctrine. When American forces crossed the Seine, the Moselle, and eventually the Rhine, artillery would once again pave the way, not in rolling barrages, but in sudden, devastating bursts. By late 1944, even smaller divisions could coordinate their own miniature instant thunder barrages using just a handful of batteries. The once complex system of calculations had become second nature. Crews knew their timing, their charts, their responsibilities by heart. But the influence of Bradley's concept didn't stop at World War II. In the years that followed, armies studied time on target as one of the most effective examples of coordinated fire in history. The U.S. Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, made it a central subject of study. Its principles shaped the doctrines of Korean War fire missions, Vietnam-era fire bases, and eventually computerized artillery systems of the late 20th century. The concept of simultaneous impact evolved with technology. By the Cold War, advanced fire control computers could perform in seconds what Bradley's officers once did by hand. New systems like multiple round simultaneous impact, MRSI, carried the same DNA, the same philosophy that multiple shells, fired at different trajectories, could land on target together for maximum shock effect. Every future innovation, from GPS-guided munitions to digital fire coordination, owed something to that first synchronized thunder over Normandy.
Time on target also transformed how armies viewed psychological warfare. In Normandy, it wasn't the volume of fire that broke the German lines, but the suddenness. Modern military planners took note. Shock, surprise, and sensory overload became recognized as legitimate weapons, as important as any gun. The instant thunder concept showed that overwhelming the mind could be as decisive as destroying the body. That insight would later shape air campaigns, missile strikes, and electronic warfare, all based on the same idea: hit the enemy everywhere at once before they can react. At a human level, the legacy of time on target lived on in the artillerymen who carried it out. Many of them were young, barely trained before being sent into the inferno of Normandy. But under Bradley's calm and exacting leadership, they learned to trust the math, the timing, the rhythm. They were soldiers of precision, not just firepower. After the war, veterans described the satisfaction of seeing a perfectly executed mission, knowing that hundreds of men and machines had acted in flawless unison. It wasn't chaos, it was like a symphony, every gun a different note, all coming together for one moment of thunder. The German perspective was equally revealing. Captured officers admitted that the Americans' ability to deliver perfectly timed strikes destroyed morale faster than any tank or aircraft. They couldn't predict it, couldn't prepare for it, and couldn't respond. Some even believed the Allies had developed a secret radar system to track them in real time. But the truth was simpler. It was human ingenuity and discipline. No magic, no secret technology, just clocks, charts, and relentless coordination. By the end of the war, Omar Bradley was known not only as a soldier's general, but as a commander who valued intelligence and precision over spectacle. He saw warfare not as chaos, but as an intricate machine, one that could be fine-tuned, timed, and perfected. Time on target became his signature legacy, a demonstration that victory comes from mastery of both science and psychology. In the decades that followed, historians would call it one of the most brilliant artillery innovations of the 20th century. Its influence was felt in every major conflict that followed, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq. Wherever artillery was called upon to strike suddenly, decisively, and without warning. It is the same principle Bradley discovered in 1944. Control the timing, and you control the battlefield. In that sense, time on target was never just a military tactic. It was a revolution in the very philosophy of war. A reminder that the most powerful weapon is not always the biggest gun, but the precise moment it fires.
Conclusion: How Bradley's instant thunder changed the future of war. As the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world took stock of what had been learned in the most devastating conflict in human history. Millions had perished, cities were in ruins, and nations lay divided. Yet, among the countless innovations that emerged from the war, few were as elegantly transformative or as quietly powerful as Omar Bradley's time on target. It did not rely on new machines, secret weapons, or impossible technology. It was born from logic, discipline, and the precise ticking of synchronized watches. And yet, it changed how modern armies thought about power itself, showing that timing and coordination could multiply strength more effectively than sheer numbers ever could. In the decades that followed, military historians came to describe time on target as the turning point between old war and modern war. Before 1944, artillery was about area, saturating ground, battering trenches, pounding the enemy for hours in waves of thunder. It was a language of exhaustion. But Bradley replaced that with something more elegant: instantaneous dominance. He proved that the key to victory was not just firepower, but synchronization, a concept that would echo into the nuclear age, the missile age, and the digital age. From the synchronized missile salvos of the Cold War to the precision drone strikes of today, every act of simultaneous destruction owes something to the moment
when Bradley's artillery struck the German lines all at once, without warning, without escalation, a single perfect storm of steel. The tactical brilliance of Time on Target lay in its simplicity. Every shell followed the laws of physics. Every gun followed the rhythm of a clock. But when hundreds of those clocks beat together, the result was devastating harmony. It turned mathematics into music and music into destruction. Even in today's era of artificial intelligence and satellite-guided munitions, the essence of Bradley's concept remains. Every coordinated strike, every synchronized impact, every multi-domain attack stems from the same seed: multiple weapons, one moment, one shock. Beyond the strategy, though, lies the human story. In the fields of Normandy, the soldiers who made instant thunder real were not scientists or engineers. They were young men, often under fire, trusting calculations scrawled in pencil and whispered through static-filled radios. They loaded, aimed, and fired in faith that unseen comrades across miles were doing the same, guided by nothing more than a ticking clock and the certainty of purpose. They didn't see the result. They only heard it. A rumble rolling back through the air, followed by silence, then the news: target destroyed. It was warfare at its most impersonal, yet paradoxically at its most human. Each man's precision made another man's survival possible. Each perfect second saved lives by ending battles faster, cleaner, more decisively.
For the Germans who faced it, Time on Target became a symbol of inevitability. No early warning, no distant rumble, just an instant where the horizon exploded. Some would later describe it as the moment they realized the war was no longer theirs to control. The Allies had turned technology and time itself into allies. Weapons that struck faster than any soldier could think. The thunder that fell on Normandy was more than just noise. It was the sound of a new kind of warfare being born. Today, historians still marvel at the genius of Bradley's doctrine. He wasn't a loud or flamboyant leader like Patton, nor a theorist like Montgomery. He was a thinker, calm, calculating, methodical. But his quiet brilliance shaped the modern battlefield more profoundly than any tank charge or bombing raid. He proved that war could be fought and won through precision. That even in chaos, order could be weaponized. That time itself could become a tool of victory. 80 years later, the phrase "time on target" remains etched in the vocabulary of every professional army. It's used in artillery fire planning, in missile coordination, in air-ground synchronization. Whenever the world witnesses the sudden, simultaneous strike of weapons landing as one, it is hearing the echo of Bradley's instant thunder. A concept born in the mud and smoke of Normandy now defines the digital age of warfare. In the end, the Germans were not simply defeated by superior firepower. They were defeated by control, by the mastery of timing, calculation, and coordination. They faced not a storm that gathered slowly, but a flash that came all at once. And that flash, that blinding instant of synchronized fury, changed war forever. Final message. Bradley's instant thunder was not just a tactic, it was a revelation. That the most devastating weapon in war is not always made of steel or fire. Sometimes it's a perfectly measured second.